Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in our Baltimore studio. I'm a host and producer here at the Real News, and I have the pleasure of being able to introduce our esteemed panel today to discuss the mainstream media and whose side they're really on. Now, joining us here in studio are our guests, James Early. To the left, he is the Director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Prior to his work with the Smithsonian, Mr. Early was an administrator at the National Endowment for Humanities in Washington. He was also the host of 10 Minutes Left, a weekly radio segment of cultural, educational, and political interviews and commentary at Howard University's radio station. He is also a former member of the board of Trans Africa. Please join me in welcoming Mr. James Early. And next to him, you might recognize his face. That is Danny Glover. He's an actor and film director. Mr. Glover is well known for his roles in The Color Purple and action film series Lethal Weapon. In 1994, he made his directorial debut with the Showtime Channel short film Override. He also, of course, is an activist who never fails to be on the right side of history when it comes to democratic rights of ordinary people. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Glover, Danny Glover. And right next to me is our CEO and senior editor, Mr. Paul Jay. So please welcome everyone here, the panel.
Thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to do a little bit of introduction, and then our guests, we're going to have a bit of a back and forth, and then open it up for questions. We frame this, whose side is the media, mainstream media on? It's a bit of a softball question for us at the Real News. But I think the answer is fairly simple. The mainstream media is on the side of people that own the mainstream media. So first of all, it's on the side of who owns it, and then it's on the side of who manages it. Managers, editors, publishers, and the journalists on the whole who work for them have their own interests. And that's one of the great deceptions about media, the idea that there's objective journalism and that the people doing it don't have their own interests. Well, they do, and so do we at the Real News. The issue of who owns it is the other, in terms of whose side mainstream media is on. Well, it's about who owns stuff. The more stuff you own, the more mainstream media is on your side. And if you own a lot of stuff, in other words, if you own the commanding heights of the economy in finance or military-industrial complex or agribusiness or pharma or go on, then the mainstream media is more on your side. And I think everybody here probably understands that. It's no different at the Real News. Whose side is the Real News on? Well, we're on the side of the people that run the Real News, first of all, which is us, because we have our own interests. And we're not above interest any more than anybody else is. The only difference with us is we earn very ordinary salaries. In fact, probably most of us think less than ordinary, certainly in our profession. We don't take corporate money, we don't take government money, we don't sell advertising. We've tried to eliminate the kinds of things in our economic model that force you into a kind of self-censorship. And when you decide whose side are you on. So, we're in a position where we can talk, very frankly and we think as honestly as we can about the situation because of our economic model. The issue of whose side you're on, and as I said, mainstream media is on the side of who owns stuff. Well, it's true here, it's true in Baltimore, it's true in Venezuela, which our guest just came back from. And in some ways, it's more obvious in Venezuela because for those of you who know, there was a coup in 2002, and our guests, I think, are going to talk a little bit more about this. But it was almost a media-organized coup to a large extent. There's an interesting film that was done by Journeyman Films, and they had in the documentary of the coup in 2002, they showed a group of the generals calling for Chavez's resignation. This is because of the shooting of unarmed demonstrators by snipers, and because of the shooting of these anti-Chavez demonstrators and the killing of some of them, Chavez should step down. Now the problem is that was recorded 2 hours before the shooting. And that was depicted in the documentary. There was actually a correspondent from CNN Spanish who was invited to the taping because they thought he would never spill the beans. And he did. that's an overt example. The less is in some ways more pernicious is what happens here, is that, you know, you report on 30 murders in Baltimore, and it seems like, well, it's just news reports, what else can we do? We're reporting what happens. But how come they never have a history, the person that was killed? And how about the person that did the killing doesn't have a real history? Why aren't they human beings? And let's talk about why there's so many murders in Baltimore. No, it's like this person got killed and that person. And why? I had an interesting conversation the other day, and I think it's clear, is because if you look at local news in Baltimore, who are they playing to? White people in the county who want to say how screwed up Baltimore is. And am I ever glad I don't live in the city? And that's where the money is. So you don't have to tell the story of who these people are. You know, if a white person in the county gets killed, well, then you do get a backstory, and you find out who they are, and it becomes a whole thing. So we're going to try to break that mold here, and if you want later in the Q&A, we can talk more about it. But you came here to hear our guests, and so I'm going to start with Danny. Danny is, in my books, rather amazing for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which, that he is always going where he's asked to go to help in a struggle. From picket lines to protests to, you know, he's someone who has always, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think he's always found his celebrity a secondary issue. I think even the acting in sort of was. Like, he was a political being to start with. And his celebrity's always been something in his tool chest to see how he can use it to help people. So I guess my first question is, talk a bit about going around the country, the kind of struggles you've been involved with, and give us a sense of what's happening.
You know, it's often as you
I'm sorry, I do add one thing to that, because there's a connection here. Why do people need Danny to come to these things? They don't need another body. Right. It's because the media is ignoring these things. Right. So you have to get Danny to come to get any media coverage, which is ridiculous. I mean, why do you need a celebrity? But you do, and he does. But go ahead.
Well, you start out at some point in your life, and for me,
talk to the crowd. Yeah.
It's for me. I consider myself a child of the civil rights movement, and I was just recently in Jackson, Mississippi, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about, and I met Bob Moses. Bob Moses was down there, but I did a film, when I had the opportunity to do a story about SNCC workers in Macomb, Mississippi in 1960. Well, in 1960, when I was 14 years old, my heroes at that time were those men and women who were part of SNCC, but it just formed. But all of this changes with time. Certainly, there's been, whether I'm responsible for it or not, there's been something of what they call a career, and we don't have to go through the films that I've been able to do. But each time, within the industry itself, and outside of the industry, it's given me accessibilities that sometimes the work that I wanted to do, the kind of projects that I wanted to do, the conversation is with, and who I can have a conversation with. And that was always important. I come out of community development. I still consider myself, when I go to one city and watch, and go to another city and watch, I consider myself a community developer, because I like the interchange and the discourse that happens when people, and I came at a time in the early 70s, working for the Model Cities program and the Office of Community Development in San Francisco, out of Mayor's office in San Francisco, at a time where I saw this exciting, most amazing, what I call organic grassroots democracy happening there. And connected to that, you know, I was connected to that as a student at San Francisco State College, and so I had an opportunity to be a part of that in my early maturation, in my early development after university. And that translates, so how am I be able to carry on and use my access, if we say at this particular point in my time, to either talk about the anti-apartheid movement, which I was very much involved in the anti-apartheid movement when I worked for the African Liberation Support Committee before I became an actor, and carried that on through the type of work, the choices that I made, and the type of work. My theatrical background is probably uncharacteristic for most black actors, primarily all of it's Ethel Fugard, the great South African playwright. So in some sense, consciously, and I say consciously because it was a conscious effort. I was able to marry those two things: the art of acting and learning the craft of acting, along with my own understanding and passion about how I wanted to see the world, where I wanted to position myself in the world as well. Those things came, and then other things happened. Is that well? So but everything is dynamic. The issues that we talk about then and they are now are different issues that we're talking about. We learn to talk about the move from the, as we would say, the general to the specific. And the specifics that I've watched, that I've been able to talk about and been a part of the discourse around what is happening in people's real lives. I don't care if it's here, working people. We see what is happening to working people in this country, or wherever it is in a place in the world. And to be a part of that discourse has certainly been, I think, along with various other people, as I'm saying right here with James Early or with Don Rojas, and to be a part of those kind of discussions now at this point in my life, a critical moment where I'm able to kind of, I'm not in a situation of quote unquote building a career, as we may say, with all your handlers and all your agents and all your PR and everything else. It's about where do we go from here, as Dr. King, where do we go from here, chaos and community? And that's where the conversation, whether it's locally here in Baltimore, whether it's where I'm involved in Ras Baraka's campaign in Newark, or whether it's with Andy Shala in DC, or wherever I'm going over a period of time, to talk about that. I believe we have an extraordinary moment right here and let's say, given that the dialects has changed and the dynamics and the contradictions change, we have an extraordinary moment to talk about how we can impact our people's lives in the political process. Well, I just returned from Mississippi, and what's been really fascinating for me is the work that workers are doing in Canton, Mississippi, at the Nissan plant in Canton, Mississippi. And I've been working in some context, in some sort of way with them for the last year and a half, directly with the workers, but more importantly, with a group of students, concerned students for Better Nissan, and also the Mississippi Students Alliance for Justice, out of Tougaloo College and out of Jackson State College. And they've been remarkable. We're in the midst of a six-city tour, which involved students and campuses in Chicago, New Orleans, we'll be in Miami, Atlanta, Tennessee, and be at college and talk with students. But what's incredible, they've been able to organize through their own vernacular, through their own language, through spoken word, and through the access to different forms of media, to social media, to access people and to talk about the issue and get people engaged in the issue. I'm only an accessory to the whole process of what they've been doing as young students. And in itself, it reminds me of those young students who 50 years ago went down to Mississippi and Alabama in Freedom Summer. Or it reminds me of the young students that I'm with, the generation I was a part of, who were involved and engaged in community activism in levels in San Francisco and around the country as well. So these students have really expanded the whole dialogue and put Nissan on notice. Now, we don't have the luxury of having the New York Times come and interview us and talk about what is really happening, or Fox News or anybody else to talk about really, CNN and talk about really action. But the information that they are able to generate through social media, through contacts and conversation, has been amazing. So yes, Nissan has responded to what is happening here. And we feel that even though the vote on Volkswagen was only a vote that was lost by 47 votes in order to have a union, that we're moving in the right direction. It is not, and we understand also, and those young people are learning, that this is not built overnight. Right. You know, often, as Dr. King would say, we're going to have victories and we're going to have defeats, And the process of this has been really enlightening for me to watch them grow in their own way, their own space, and create the kind of the language that's necessary for them to move forward. The language of social activism, the language of looking at their own lives in relationship to building community. All those are the things that I see apparent over the last, in my work with them. That's been one thing that I've worked on consistently over this last period. And, but access, and certainly access to this discourse, access to the conversation, is not something that we find. And I have to come here to Real News and talk about that. I have to find other ways of talking about that. You know, maybe there's a local paper, or maybe there's a school paper that talks about that. I have so many, in the event we had on Friday night with Common, brought Common in. Common, who's an activist and a major hip hop artist here, they brought them, and it just elevated people's sense of themselves and their possibilities with bringing him in there. And it is important lessons for all of us, you know, because while we see that the situation, as we see in people's real lives, become desperate and more desperate, we see this advance where young people are taking charge and being the architects of this whole process as well.
James, how much of this kind of spirit do you see?
Well, I was just thinking, as Danny was talking, we are of the same generation. We're 7 years different in our age. I'm from Tallahassee, Florida, in the South, where I too saw the Black Church, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, young people. And, you know, we are the stuff of media, all of us. Without our lives, the intrigues of our lives, the successes, the failures of our lives, are just our lives where the media creates its own spin about our lives, then there is no such thing as news. I once did a program on my 10 Minutes Left program at Howard University on what is news. And just listening to Danny and thinking about that period, one of the things about news, including the real news, is an active citizenship. We can either be the inanimate objects being moved around, sort of the visual chessboard of the media, or we can wait for the real news to say, you know, you ought to be looking at these people, or we can be an active expression of democracy, as were these young people during the 1960s, and white people who crossed over, not abandoning who white people were, but looking for a different kind of humanity, not to become black, but to build a new America out of black and white. We were not talking about Latinos or gay, lesbian people, or even rural people in that age. But so news is very much what we can make it rather than what it can make of us. That's one of the lessons, I think, coming out of the 1960s. That the rupture with American apartheid on the part particularly of young and old black people coming out of the church says we will not live in the society as it is organized any longer, and force the media, and we must remember television, we became the commodity of television, the stuff of television. Now, while they used that to say what was going on, it was the citizens who brought the morality to the story.
Absolutely.
It was the citizens who made them focus on the story. Now we're in a different era, a totally different era of social media where you can look at your own navel, talk about your own earring, or you can talk about something more substantive like what's going on in the union or why there is so much violence. But we still have to grapple with these major convening focal points called mass media, even as we take advantage of social media. And so I think it's incumbent on us to draw some lessons from that period about whose side the news is on. We get in and we make sure that we are the active ingredient in that mediation. And that means even progressive, democratic-minded media like the Real News. Again, you can either wait for it to come and cover you, or you can engage it, as you see all of these young adults who are being hired here, who are behind these cameras, that this is a public social space, not just a typical media space, where this is a town meeting, meaning that you, the demos, the active citizen, the ordinary people, are bringing your views and mediating, discussing, and debating. And the news then is a refractor and a facilitator for that. So I think it's incumbent on us to do that. Otherwise, we will simply remain the objects of their intrigue. And there's all kinds of intrigue. We can see what's happening with the Malaysian plane. No one knew what in the hell was going on. But it was an interesting way to take us off away from serious matters like what's going on right here with Nissan workers, or what's going on with violence in our streets, of why Ras Baraka, for example, in Newark is running about the issue of violence, and he's saying that what goes on here is not just in Newark, it's something going on across the country, or Andy Shalal in Washington, that this is not just about who will be mayor of Washington, although that is the nation's capital, but these issues are the same issues going on all over the country, and therefore what used to be sort of isolated, this city, that city, connects us. Baltimore is a classic example. We don't know enough in this country about Baltimore. And I don't say that simply because I'm sitting here. I live 30 miles away. But this is an extraordinary city in both its virtues and both its failings. And we would hardly know that you were here. Now, that places some responsibility on us vis-a-vis the news. We really have to be more creative and more active and less just personal in how we communicate through our social media. But we have to convene. This is a public space to convene. This is not the only public space. But we have got to make the news come to us and make the news open up, despite its own interests, to hear our voice. That's what governance and mediation is about. Otherwise, we are the passive citizens. And Venezuela is one of those areas where we see a lot of dynamism of a whole construct called participatory democracy and active citizenship. Citizens saying, no, I will not wait every 2 to 4 or 8 years to see what you've done with me. I'm going to be on your doorstep daily. And of course, there are really strong, intense things going on, people standing on both sides of that divide, except somebody won. And it's like the other side is like the Tea Party saying, I don't care who won, I'm not going to respect that. I'm not going to deal with the protocols. I'm going to call you nasty names, racial names. I don't really care what women said at the voting box. Your place is in the kitchen, waiting on the man to come home. There are large numbers of people in this country who think that way, and these are well-educated people who think that way. So these are some reflections about whose side the media is on, the news is on, and I think some lessons that we can draw from that great democratic moment called the Civil Rights Movement, which is too often just posed as a black-white dynamic. There's no question but that black people were the catalytic force, but there is no question that white and Latinos who decided they did not want to live in that world joined them not to become a part of the black community, but to become a part of a new American community, and the news was forced to reflect that.
Thank you.